Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Iran. Iran has expanded its energy exports. Venezuela, Turkey, Iraq are now importing energy from Iran. That's a big deal. There's no question about it. Now, these business deals are taking place even as the United States is trying to squeeze Iran and increase the impact of sanctions against the Persian nation. It's become a high stakes diplomatic game of push me, pull you, that Dr. Doolittle character. While the United States pushes in one direction, Iran pulls in the other direction. Iran is expanding inroads and enticing trading partners, and Iran has been much more successful in their efforts to keep their country economically viable, even economically strong, than one would expect, especially given the unrelentless U.S. sanctions and press coverage about it. Turkey is the third country to import Iran's oil that I have found in the last little while. In May, let's say, for instance, five massively loaded oil tankers made their way from Iranian shores to Venezuela. Iraq has, for some time, had energy business with Iran, actually a great business. Reports are that Iran has also begun negotiations with Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is particularly relevant information. If the deals go through, and there's no reason to believe that they will not go through, Iran will be positioned to fill a vacuum in those nations. The United States is gearing up to wind down in those very regions. They plan to withdraw from Afghanistan and severely reduce troop presence in Pakistan. And the United States pulls out, Iran steps in. This scenario has been played out before. It is what happened in Iraq. After the United States pulled out, Iran began exerting more and more pressure on the Iraqis. And now, Iran exerts tremendous power in Iraq. Iraq and Turkey are the two major markets Iran has the most interest in developing. Turkey is their foothold to the west and will be used as a springboard into countries interested in trade. Iraq is an untapped resource as we know it. That's important to recognize. Iraq is a place for Iran to exploit and to sell to. According to reports, Iran has already signed a 2-year deal with Iraq to provide electricity and other forms of energy. That makes Iran an essential partner in the development of Iraq. More will follow, there's no question about it, and not just economically. Religion, too, plays a very important role in Iran's interest in courting Iraq. Iran and Iraq are bordering nations. Iraqi Shiite population is now close in number to their Sunni population. This is a significant issue for Shiite Iran, not only because there is strength in numbers, but also because Iraq is home to several essential Shiite shrines. The Middle East is a jigsaw puzzle, there's no question about it. There are many countries in need of big brother assistance, and many countries from the inside the region and out vying for control of those countries. Iran is deeply invested, let's say, in Syria. Control of Iraq is hugely important. Coupled with their involvement in Syria, will enable Iran to fulfill their ultimate objective of controlling a land bridge from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to the Mediterranean Sea. For the purposes of trade and for the sheer sense of power it lends them, this access from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean enables Iran to access whole new worlds. And best of all, it will be done without the watchful eyes of the United States. And now, Iran has received an added bonus, a gift from above, as you will. Iran is celebrating the internal crisis of the United States. Battling in the United States an internal, almost civil crisis. They're taking advantage of the situation. So too are China, so too is Russia and Turkey. The nemeses of the United States are related that the United States is suffering from internal strife, and that because they are still in the throes of COVID-19, the reopening of the markets in the United States has been shackled. And this is important to see. You must recognize it. You see, just about every country that the United States has chastised, lectured, and preached to about morality has sided with the protesters and cited the protesters as proof that the United States is a racist nation. At a press conference in Tehran recently, the spokesman of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, Abbas Mousavi, condemned the United States, saying, and this is the quote, "To the American people, the world has heard your outcry over the state of oppression. The world is standing with you. To American officials and police, stop violence against your people and let them breathe," unquote. He said that Iran is saddened to see, quote, "the violence in the United States police have recently set off. We deeply regret to see the American people who peacefully seek respect and no more violence being suppressed indiscriminately and met with utmost violence." That's a quote. And to make sure that the country's message was heard loud and clear and understood by all, Mousavi, the Iranian foreign minister's spokesperson, said, and this was important, he delivered the message in English. The Iranian spokesman could not miss an opportunity to twist the dagger some more. He drew the parallel between the domestic American crisis and U.S. foreign policy, of course, when he also accused the United States of, quote, "practicing violence and bullying at home and abroad," unquote. This has been one of the worst periods in modern U.S. history. And for that fact alone, it has been one of the best ever for Iran. Iranian strategy has been point perfect. They have used every possible opportunity, and there have been many, to make gains against the United States. And to point by point, they have been successful. I've also been thinking about flying. Since the beginning of COVID-19, Israel has shut down its airspace and airports to almost every airline. On those few flights that do make it to Israel's Ben Gurion Airport, only Israelis are permitted to enter Israel. And after their arrival, every Israeli must quarantine for 14 days. Now, this is important. For months now, no foreigners have been permitted entry into Israel, unless, of course, you were a Secretary of State, Pompeo, or foreign minister from a friendly nation. From the start of the pandemic, only 2 airlines continued to fly on a daily basis to Israel. They're United Air, flying from Newark, New Jersey, and Ethiopian Air, flying from Addis Ababa. More airlines exclusively carrying Israeli passengers into Israel have begun running flights returning to Israel and taking people out. They include Delta Air, Canada Air, Wizz. Wizz is a brand new streamlined Hungarian airline. Wizz, interestingly, specializes in short hops city to city within Europe. Their business model is akin to Spirit and Frontier with no frills, but it specializes in the short distances within Europe for business travelers. Tel Aviv has more than the critical mass of business people traveling to Europe, so it is now on the Wizz map. United from Newark to Tel Aviv is easy to understand. But why Ethiopian Air? Ethiopia is the centerpiece of the Israeli business market and model in Africa. From Ethiopia, an Israeli CEO can hop anywhere else in Africa. Equally important, but not well touted, is the Mossad is extremely active in Africa. And under the guise, often of business, Ethiopia is their point of entry. And now it all starts to make sense. Another airline that just began routes to Israel twice in 2 weeks is the United Arab Emirates. They have sent a direct flight to Israel twice in 2 weeks. Those planes were not as welcome as the others. It was not the Israelis who shunned them, but the Palestinians. The Palestinians actually were interesting here because the planes were actually sent. They're Etihad Air. It's the second largest United Arab Emirates airline company. The planes were carrying critical and crucial supplies intended for the Palestinian Authority. The second plane to arrive had 14 tons of medical supplies intended to help the Palestinian Authority fight coronavirus. But the PA refused to accept the aid from that flight as well as the first flight. Palestinian Authority already refused the first flight, and it's strange. Those supplies are not accounted for. We don't know where they are exactly. At least I don't know where they are yet. No one can say where the first flight and medical materials went. Maybe they actually made it surreptitiously into the Palestinian Authority. The reason the Palestinians rejected it was that the United Arab Emirates flew directly to Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. and they were both official Etihad air flights. But rather than carrying passengers, these flights carried cargo, and they were both unmarked, so as not to raise suspicions. The Palestinians have tried to explain that they refused to accept and barely acknowledge the gift of about 30 tons of humanitarian coronavirus aid that included 10 ventilators, 10, presented to them by another Arab country. They have given the reason for why they rejected the gifts, not once but twice, that were flown from Abu Dhabi to Tel Aviv on the Etihad Air. They said, and I'm quoting here, "We refused the aid from the UAE because it wasn't coordinated through us or any of our systems." Well, that's poppycock. At a press conference briefing in Bethlehem to explain the decision, Palestinian Health Minister Micah Halpern put it this way. He said, and I'm quoting, "We are an authority and have our sovereignty, and we can't accept such aid without coordinating with us," unquote. Well, that's strange because they didn't have the money even to pay for their salaries recently of all their employees. This reason for rejecting the aid had nothing to do with coordination. The bottom line is that the Palestinian Authority cannot condone that the United Arab Emirates is flying directly into Israel. Because they're flying into Israel, the UAE is de facto signaling their recognition of the Jewish state. The arrival of the UAE flights in Tel Aviv means recognition of Israel by yet another Arab country, and that the Palestinian Authority has difficulty with. From the perspective of the Palestinian leadership, this is another example of loosening of control of Palestinians once had on the world vis-a-vis Israel. Once upon a time, when the PA asked Arab leaders to shun Israel, that's what they did. They did it out of respect for the Palestinian Authority. That respect is eroded. The stranglehold the Palestinians have on Arabs to reject Israel until their wish list is totally fulfilled is crumbling fast. The United Arab Emirates is sending aid to the Palestinians. That was a simple humanitarian gesture with an added twist. Etihad in Arabic means united. United Arab Emirates, you get the point. The Emirates are ideally positioned to help the Palestinians, while at the same time gain from their interaction with Israel. They are a collection of 7 emirates united under one leadership. The United Arab Emirates has a population of 9.2 million people, but almost everyone there is a foreign worker. Of the 9.2 million people living in the United Arab Emirates, only 1.4 million are citizens. The United Arab Emirates flying into Israel and helping the Palestinians should have been a win-win-win, a 3-way win for all 3 parties. Now it's just win-win. Win for Israel and win for the United Arab Emirates. Palestinian leadership keeps making mistake after mistake. The Palestinian people continue to bear the burden of their folly. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column by Uri Heitner from Ynet, which is the website of Yediot Ahronot. It was published on June 13th, 2020, and it's entitled "One More Acre for the Land of Israel." Now, this is important to recognize because the thesis of the column is that Israeli leadership on issues of foreign policy historically, and the Palestinians, has traditionally succeeded through compromise. And that's the thesis. It's a very good thesis and an accurate one, I think. The all-or-nothing approach was not the style of David Ben-Gurion. And Heitner argues that this style has been enormously successful in the time since Israel was created. Had they been an all-or-nothing philosophy, Israel may never have been established at all. Now, Heitner begins by saying the following. On the day the United Nations Assembly accepted the partition plan for Palestine on November 29, 1947, the Jewish community in pre-state Palestine came out in droves to celebrate in the streets. And yet, there were also those who received the decision with contempt and even mourned it. The revisionist right and the unified kibbutz saw it as a disaster that tears up and surrenders the land of Israel. Heitner now explains that Ben-Gurion disagreed with the revisionists and was far more practical in the way in which he approached this solution. Heitner writes, David Ben-Gurion had no love for the plan for the land of Israel, and yet he had a wide historical view coupled with a realist political mindset. He understood that the all-or-nothing approach could leave us with nothing. He realized that we were in the midst of a historical situation, a chance to renew the sovereignty of the Jewish people on the land of Israel after 2,000 years of exile, and that this may be a now or never opportunity. Ben-Gurion realized that this was an opportunity that may never return, and that must not be missed at all costs. And so he made the call, and most people supported his decision. Would he have followed the advice of the extremist? It is doubtful the state of Israel would have been established. Heitner, in this particular case, continues, he actually explains that this is an extremely bold assertion. I must tell you that. You cannot argue with success, though. As bold as it is, it was right. Israel was established because David Ben-Gurion's actions and decisions. His decisions and actions were not perfect, but they were successful. Heitner continues, these black and white extremists are unable to contain the complexity of the plan, so they stick to the all or nothing approach out of their unwillingness to settle for less than everything. They, and all of us, may end up with nothing. Heitner concludes his column with a general critique of the right and of the praise of the left. This is where his analysis is most weak and where he shows his partisanship over intellectualism. Ideas and truth should always trump politics. He concludes by bringing forth the famous Alon plan, which came immediately after the Six-Day War. Yigal Allon, a former general turned politician, proposed applying Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley, along with Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. The plan was rejected. Heitner writes, at the June 1967 government meeting in which it was decided to apply Israeli sovereignty to the whole of Jerusalem, Yigal Allon proposed to apply sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and Mount Hebron. His proposition was declined, yet he did not think to object to apply sovereignty over Jerusalem, and he even moved his offices to the capital's Jewish quarter. The Allon plan was rejected, but Yigal Allon was the Minister of Labor at the time and compromised and supported the Jerusalem proposal. Next up is a column from Al Jazeera. Now, the column was published on June 4th and is written by Richard Silverstein. Silverstein defines himself as the author of the Tikkun Olam blog, devoted to exposing the excesses of the Israeli national security state. The column is entitled, A Biden Presidency Would Not Be Good News for Palestine, and it's subtitled, Joe Biden Cannot Afford, Even If He Wanted to, an Independent Approach to U.S. Policy Towards Israel. It should be clear, Silverstein supports Hamas. He views Israel as the cause of all the problems in the Middle East. He believes that all means can be used to stop Israel's oppression. So he defends Hamas, and he defends their targeting of Israeli citizens. He endorses Palestinian terrorism against Israelis, and Richard Silverstein himself does not call them terrorists or murderers. He defends Hamas's attack on Palestinians who criticize Hamas. Silverstein is not a lover of Israel, but his voice is strong and his published columns and read by many people who do not know better. We need to know what he is writing about, and that's why I brought his column today. This column was published in Al Jazeera. The website often has a broad spectrum of ideas, but this piece by Silverstein is definitely preaching to the converted on Al Jazeera. He begins, I do not take too kindly to people telling me that I am an anti-Semite. Though the Democratic Party's presumptive nominee for president, Joe Biden, did not say that to my face, he might just as well have. On May 19th, Biden conducted an online fundraiser co-hosted by the former Obama ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, and pro-Israel academic Deborah Lipstadt. According to the New York Times, Biden told donors that it was important to condemn criticism of Israel that drifts towards anti-Semitism, including on the political left, as even he acknowledged that he had gotten in trouble for such calls in the past. Criticism of Israel's policy is not anti-Semitism, Biden said, but too often that criticism from the left morphs into anti-Semitism. Silverstein explains who he is and that he is a Jew, not an anti-Semite, and certainly was insulted by being called an anti-Semite by a non-Jew. The column continues, quote, as a Jew who was on the political left, critical of Israel, of Israeli apartheid, and a supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, I am clearly what he considers an anti-Semite. Biden's generalization is not only false, it is offensive. No one tells me that my views are anti-Semitic. Not a fellow Jew, not a non-Jew, especially not a presidential candidate who is kissing the behinds of pro-Israel donors in order to rake in big campaign bucks. But Biden is actually correct in his description of Silverstein. Silverstein is telling his readers, aka others who believe in his perspective, that there will be little difference between Trump and Biden. He writes, he will be slightly better than Trump, but that is not saying much. It's like a doctor telling you he has good news and bad news. The good news is you don't have that you do not have an inoperable cancer. The bad news, you have multiple sclerosis. The shame of this argument, and this is the problem with Silverstein, is that the far left thinks that the moderate left has been transformed into fascists, into people who no longer believe in the principles of the left. The extremism of Silverstein only alienates the left and only alienates the mainstream left, and that's where the shame really emerges. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 3 cartoons today. First up is a still shot of the ABC News broadcast from the news desk in Washington. It's about the rioting. And the beauty of today's technology is that one can mute the broadcast of most systems and allow subtitles so that you can read and follow part of the fast-paced news without needing the extra sounds. The subtitles are computer generated. They often learn the speaker's cadence and style and their elocution. But certain expressions are preferred and defaulted when certain sounds are heard. The computer is just like our ears and our brain. We do the same thing. In this case, the subtitle quote is, rioters are trying to use Mazel Tov cocktails to burn up police cars. Obviously, that's not what was said. It sounded like Mazel Tov. That's what the computer heard. It was very funny. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Molotov, a Bolshevik and protege of Stalin, would not be so happy to have been mixed up with this Mazel Tov. Next up is a play on Kermit the Frog. Things are simply so crazy today. There are no boundaries to normal. Kermit is looking out the window and it's raining. Kermit says, sounds like thunder outside. But the way 2020 is going, it could be Godzilla. Third up is a cartoon and a slide with a quote. The quote makes fun of working remotely from home, which is one of the most common things that's happened in the last few months. Even as we return to normal, people are going to be working from home. There are a lot of very upside down things that are happening, which will remain in place for a while. This is the quote. Did a load of pajamas so I would have clean work clothes this week. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Palestinians have sent a message that they are willing to resume talks with Israel. The catch is that they want Russia to moderate, not the United States. This is a major step forward on the part of the Palestinians. It is also a very sly diplomatic move. This catapults Russia into the central role in the Middle East. The Palestinians now know full well that Israel has never agreed to talks run by Russia instead of the United States. Hopefully they will not agree this time either. Palestinian Foreign Minister of Affairs, Minister Riyad al-Maliki, said, quote, we trust President Vladimir Putin and are sure that such a meeting would bear fruit and succeed in getting us back to the talks, as well as stopping the Israeli plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. Israel has a desperate need to find world approbation. That might just persuade them to take the bait and engage in a very destructive agreement. The Palestinians have also announced that they will not accept tax money that was collected for them by Israel. The Oslo Accord, signed in Washington, D.C. in 1993, and then in Taba in 1995, outlined that Israel will collect all taxes on imports to the Palestinians, transport it through Israeli ports, and then transfer those taxes to the Palestinians monthly. That tax amounts to about 50% of the Palestinian budget. Palestinian logic for rejecting their own money is that Israel is planning on annexing the parts of the West Bank. This is just an example of poor decision-making and poor leadership on the parts of the Palestinians. Rejecting the money does not hurt Israel. It places no pressure on Israel. Actually, not taking the money, not taking the tax money, their own taxes, is helpful for Israel. Israel will earn interest on that money. They are hoisting themselves on their own petard, Palestinian style. We have not done enough for Jewish communities outside of Israel. That's a quote. That quote comes from Benny Gantz, who gave an interview to the Israeli daily Makor Rishon. Gantz is Israel's new defense minister and alternate prime minister. He's scheduled to assume the prime ministry in 18 months. He's correct. The relationship between the United States and Israel is an all-time low, and it needs to be developed. It's worse today than ever. Jews around the world should be connected to Israel better. The real challenge is determining how Israel can present itself in a more approachable manner to those Jews, enticing them to connect to the Jewish state. If Gantz can do more than simply speak about this disconnect and actually conceptualize, implement, and fund realistic ways to connect the communities, he will be on his way to building a significant bridge for Jewish communities outside of Israel. Iran is a split community, you should know that. It's a split nation as a whole. We cannot know the true percentages, but we do know that there are two dramatically different and divergent groups there. One traditional and one which is more modern. One older and one younger. One group wants modernization and openness. More than anything else, this group wants cultural openness. They come out to protest almost every day. They use computer software to end around oppressive restrictions and their conservative leadership. They are hopeful, and they are very pro-West. Another issue is Saudi Arabia here. Saudi Arabia has been hit extremely hard by COVID-19. Over 100,000 sick. So the Saudis are actually they're actually ending the Hajj, the traditional pilgrimage to Muslim sites in Saudi Arabia. One of the pillars of Islam is the Hajj. 2.5 million Muslims visit Saudi Arabia every year on a Hajj. They raise about $12 billion in revenue from the Hajj. So they have eliminated and suspended the Hajj for right now. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that the Molotov cocktail was actually first invented in Finland in 1939? They nicknamed it after the Soviet politician that we were talking about as a cheap and expensive homemade bomb. Molotov was a protege of Stalin. I mentioned that earlier. He was the Soviet foreign minister and signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, along with Ribbentrop, who was the Nazi foreign minister. The Russians, in other words, the USSR, and the Nazi Germans agreed to attack Poland and divide the spoils of Poland into three sections. The eastern section to the Soviets, the western section to the Germans, and the middle section, the middle third, would be a general government, that's what it was called, administered by Germany. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.